The liquid legend of moonshine. I'm your host, G, and welcome to the Stuff You Should Think About podcast, where I answer everyday questions about phenomena and objects. This episode is going to be about liquid courage, midnight steals, and the real story of moonshine. Hey there. Yep, you. And I'm glad you're hanging out with me today. Pull up a chair, maybe grab a glass of water or something a little stronger if the mood strikes you. Because today we're going to talk about something that sits right at the intersection of American folklore, legal rebellion, and chemistry. We're talking about moonshine. Now, when you hear that word, what comes to mind? Maybe it's a sepia tone memory of a guy in overalls standing next to a copper still in the Appalachian woods. Maybe it's a mason jar filled with clear liquid that tastes like a campfire and gasoline. Or maybe you think of a roaring 20s gangsters in pinstripes and the birth of NASCAR. But here's the thing. The history of moonshine isn't just about breaking the law. It's a story about independence, survival, and how liquid can change the course of a nation. So let's peel back the label and see what's really inside. The origin story. Why moonshine? Before we dive into science, let's get to the terminology right. Why do we call it moonshine? It's actually pretty poetic. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the term was British slang for anything done by the light of the moon. It implied something illicit, something secretive. But when it came to liquor, the name stuck because that's exactly when the distilling had to happen. If you were running a secret still, you couldn't be cranking out smoke in the middle of the day. You had to wait until the sun went down so the neighbors or the taxman wouldn't spot the telltale wisps of steam rising from your hidden copper pot. A good fact, while we associate moonshine with the American South, the tradition of home distilling followed immigrants from Scotland and Ireland to the Appalachian Mountains. They brought their family recipes and their copper distilling techniques, finding that the landscapes of the U.S. was a perfect place for hiding a quiet operation. The why, taxation and rebellion. You might think, gee, why was everyone so hell-bent on making this stuff behind closed doors? Why not? Just buy a bottle at the store. Well, it all comes down to the almighty dollar. After the Revolutionary War, the U.S. government was deep in debt. Alexander Hamilton, our first Secretary of the Treasury, needed a way to pay for it. His brilliant and highly unpopular idea, the whiskey tax of 1791, for farmers in the backcountry, whiskey wasn't just a drink, it was currency. It was easier to transport a barrel of whiskey over rugged mountain terrain than it was to transport a wagon full of rotting corn. When the government came knocking for their cut, the farmers felt betrayed. They weren't just being taxed on a product, they were being taxed on their livelihood. That led to the Whiskey Rebellion. Though the rebellion was eventually crushed by George Washington's personally leading troops into the field, the spirit of, I'll make my own, thank you very much, never really went away. That's the core of the moonshine ethos. It's not about alcohol, it's about autonomy. The science of the still. Now, let's get into the how. I want you to imagine a giant pot. Inside You've got a mash, usually corn, sugar, water, and yeast. You heat it up, but you don't boil it to a frenzy. You're looking for a very specific temperature. Alcohol boils at a lower temperature than water, about 173 degrees Fahrenheit, compared to water 212 degrees. If you maintain that heat, the alcohol turns into steam, rises through a coil, we call this the worm, and gets chilled by cold water. It condenses back into liquid, dripping out the other end. Here's a small, slightly terrifying fact. That's the basic science, but the execution is where people get in trouble. When you distill, there's something called the foreshots. These are the very first drops that come out of the still. They contain methanol, which is toxic. If you don't know how to cut the run, meaning separating the good stuff from the dangerous stuff, you're basically poisoning your product. That's where the rot gut reputation came from. The Prohibition era, the golden age of crime. If the 1800s were the birth of moonshine, the 1920s were its graduation to the big leagues. Prohibition didn't stop people from drinking. It just ensured that the government stopped getting tax revenue and the criminals started getting rich. This is when moonshine became a sophisticated high-stakes game. You had the rum runners and the bootleggers. And talk about innovation, this is arguably when the American car culture was born. To outrun the police on winding, unpaved mountain roads, moonshiners started souping up their engines and modifying their suspensions to handle heavy loads of liquor. When Prohibition ended, those drivers didn't just retire. They started taking their souped up cars to a track. And that, my friend, is how we got NASCAR. So next time you watch a stock car race, remember, you're essentially watching the legacy of a bunch of guys running from the law with a trunk full of corn whiskey. Is all moonshine legal? Is all moonshine illegal? So, where does that leave us today? Walking into a store, you see jars of moonshine on the shelf, some with flavors like apple pie or peach. Is that the real deal? Mostly, no. What you're buying in a liquor store is technically legal moonshine. It's unaged corn whiskey because it hasn't spent time in an oak barrel, which gives bourbon its color and complex flavor. It remains clear, just like the mountain stuff, but it's produced in a licensed, taxed facility. It's safe, it's regulated, and it's a far cry from the stuff brewed in a bathtub in 1934. Here's a fun fact. In many states, it is still technically illegal to distill your own spirits at home, even for personal consumption, unlike beer or wine, which you can brew in your kitchen without the feds knocking down your door. Distilling requires a federal permit costing thousands of dollars to even start the process. It's one of the last true outlaw activities that are still culturally celebrated. The cultural significance. I want to pivot for a second. We talk about moonshine as this gritty, dangerous thing. But there's a human element here that we often overlook. In the Appalachian tradition, a jar of moonshine wasn't just for getting drunk. It was medicine. It was used as an antiseptic for wounds, a rub for sore muscles, and even a soother for colicky babies. It was a social lubricant that brought communities together during hard times. When you look at it through that lens, moonshine feels less like a crime and more like a pillar of survivalist architecture. It represents a people who were able to generate their own power, their own currency, and their own remedies when the rest of the world felt a million miles away. So here's what I want you to think about after we wrap this up. We live in a world where everything is branded, taxed, regulated, and barcoded. We have a specific lane for every product we consume. Moonshine stands as this stubborn, jagged edge in our history. It reminds us that there was a time when the things we consume weren't just items off a shelf, but the product of raw human ingenuity and a little bit of defiance. Whether you're drinking a legal moonshine cocktail at a trendy downtown bar, or you're hearing stories about your great grandfather's hidden operation in the woods, you're touching a piece of American history that refused to be silenced. But, and I got to say this one for the record, don't go trying to build a steel in your garage tonight. The science is cool, the history is fascinating, but the risk, that's definitely something you should think about. Thanks for hanging out with me today. It's always a pleasure to dig into the weird and wild and the wonderful parts of our lives. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and hey, maybe keep your spirits high. And for those of you that are more curious, this episode made you more curious, here are a few things you should check out. The Whiskey Text, 1791, the catalyst for the American moonshine identity. Methanol, your worst enemy in the distilling process. It's why cutting the run is the most important part of the job. NASCAR connection. Illegal bootlegging runs led to performance-modified cars, eventually birthing a multi-billion-dollar sport. And lastly, legality. Home distilling remains a federal crime in the U.S., distinct from the home brewing of beer and wine. Stay curious.